So, welcome everyone to this Sahaja Yoga meeting, and I'm going to pursue this line of inquiry into the principles that underpin our culture. This is an attempt to understand them, and in this talk I'm going to be going back to the time of Marie Antoinette, which I tackled last time, and we'll be talking about Edmund Burke, who I quoted, talking about Marie Antoinette. In the centre of Bristol, a few yards away from where there stood a statue of Edward Colston, the philanthropist and slave trader, until a mob threw it into the harbour about 3 years ago. It made headlines everywhere, more or less. A few yards away from that, which is just an empty plinth now, there's a fine statue of Edmund Burke, who was MP for the city in the 1770s. The inscription on it says, "I wish to be a member of Parliament, to have my share of doing good and resisting evil." In a way, I feel it's surprising they didn't throw it into the harbour as well, because Burke is generally regarded as the founding father of conservatism, with a small c. But they probably didn't know who he was. I mentioned him a few weeks ago in relation to his praise of Marie Antoinette. Tonight, I want to talk a little more about him because I feel an understanding of Burke throws a lot of light on the left and right sides and how they relate to politics and society. Burke may have been a conservative, but he wasn't a Tory. He belonged to the other party of the time, the Whigs. Perhaps the simplest term to describe him is as a classical liberal. He wasn't actually English either, although he referred to himself loosely as such. He was Irish, born in Dublin in 1729, the son of a solicitor. He moved to England to study law, but instead made his way as a writer, politician, and philosopher. He supported the American colonists in their struggle for self-representation. So that was about 10 years before the French Revolution. Although belonging to the Church of England himself, he was against oppressive measures against Catholics and dissenters. He was supportive of Hindus and Muslims. He was one of the earliest supporters of William Wilberforce's great work towards the abolition of slavery. And he was particularly critical of the behavior of the East India Company in India. He was one of the main figures behind the impeachment of Warren Hastings for exploitation, who was the governor of Bengal at the time. So he was very much a liberal, but he drew the line at the French Revolution when it broke out in 1789. And in the following year, he wrote, 1790, he wrote his most famous work in response to it, or rather in response to the enthusiasm with which was widely felt for it in England. This started off as a letter, this response of his, but quickly turned into a book, his reflections on the revolution in France. This book had a big impact at the time, was a bestseller, but it certainly wasn't popular with everyone. Many people in England, even in Parliament, welcomed the revolution. They saw it as a blow against authoritarianism, against monarchy, against the church, continuation of the American Revolution, a blow for freedom, equality, democracy, kind of updating of the world. Bliss was it to be in that dawn. No, I've misread that. Bliss was it in that dawn to be alive. Wordsworth famously wrote of the early days of the revolution, and Coleridge agreed. Tom Paine, who had seen Burke as an ally in the struggle for American independence, now saw him as a traitor to the cause and wrote his book, The Rights of Man, in direct opposition to Burke's reflections. And the same with the feminist Mary Wollstonecraft, who wrote A Vindication of the Rights of Men at the same time. The influential Whig politician Charles James Fox saw Burke's anti-revolutionary attitude as the end of their great friendship, was actually in tears in the House of Commons over this. Different times. Thomas Jefferson took a still darker view of Burke, going so far as to write to a friend in 1791, "The revolution of France does not astonish me so much as the revolution of Mr. Burke," and went on to complain about this evidence of the rottenness of his mind. Anyway, I came to look at Burke's reflections when I was researching the book I wrote recently, The Pearl of Wisdom. And I was struck by a quality in Burke's writing. It's a quality of passionate concern combined with what seemed to me that very rare thing, wisdom. Gladstone, the famous Victorian Prime Minister, writing in his diary 100 years after the reflections came out, described Burke's thought as sometimes almost divine. And that was what I felt, in the sense that it seemed very sahaj, really inspired. It was certainly prophetic. Burke was writing before the reign of terror began in France, but he could see the way things were going, and he foresaw that the revolution would split into factionalism and anarchy, which in turn would prepare the ground for a strong leader, a dictator, to come along, which is exactly what happened with the arrival of Napoleon. Lord Macaulay, writing in the 1850s, called Burke the greatest Englishman since Milton. And Dr. Johnson, who knew him, said this of him: "You could not," I don't know why he put it like this, maybe it had the experience, but anyway, "you could not stand for 5 minutes with that man beneath a shed while it rained, but you must be convinced you had been standing with the greatest man you had ever yet seen." Yet I don't think Burke is particularly well known these days. Well known in some circles, but not many. Probably better known in the US than here. So what does he say, and why should we care? He's not trying to put forward a new theory of politics or a new system. It's more that he's presenting an attitude. At the basis of that attitude is what the American economist Thomas Sowell calls the constrained vision of man. This sees man as a complex being with the potential for good and the potential for bad. We are born with a shadow, as it were, except that the shadow is within. Our problems are mostly of our own making because of human, this is Burke, pride, ambition, avarice, revenge, lust, sedition, hypocrisy, ungoverned zeal, and all the train of disorderly appetites that afflict us, according to him. I suppose it sounds obvious when you say that, until we come to the opposite view of man, the unconstrained vision, which was that of most famously, I think of Jean-Jacques Rousseau, who died about 10 years before the French Revolution, and which is summed up in that famous line of his, that man is born free, but is everywhere in chains. Rousseau's philosophy, which was accepted by the intellectuals behind the French Revolution, Robespierre was a big fan, and which is still very much alive today in our culture, was that man is essentially pure and good, and that therefore the problem with the way things are in the world does not lie in man himself, but rather in his institutions, beginning with the family, carrying on through schooling, and of course the church, culture in general, and ending up with government. If only these institutions could be re-engineered properly in a rational, scientific, progressive way, then man's natural goodness would flourish and everything would be wonderful. Another way of putting Rousseau's argument, this unconstrained vision, is that what is wrong with man is not his ego, which is in essence perfect, but his conditioning, the conditioning imposed upon him through these institutions of society and so on. Burke, on the other hand, stands up for the value of conditioning, especially as we are social beings, insofar as we are social beings. Of course, there are stupid kinds of conditioning, outdated kinds, but if we refuse to accept any conditions at all, if we have no generally accepted conventions and traditions, we would have chaos. For Burke, then, our institutions are vital. Rather than jumping in to criticize them at every opportunity, as is the modern way, he's amazed that they exist in the first place. They have been developed over the centuries and they are not to be discarded lightly. That's his view. The institution of marriage is particularly valuable in his view again. It has, quote, done more towards the peace, happiness, settlement, and civilization of the world than any other part in God's whole scheme of divine wisdom, he says. In modern language, we could translate what he's saying into the idea that marriage and other institutions have been inspired from the unconscious, this scheme of divine wisdom. So they're not altogether artificial man-made creations. And one of the things he felt was most damaging about what the revolutionaries were doing in France was that they were downgrading marriage, making it a civil contract rather than something underpinned by the sacred, and making divorce much easier. Again, he wrote in a sort of key quote this, "The nature of man is intricate. The objects of society are of the greatest possible complexity, and therefore no simple disposition or direction of power can be suitable either to man's nature or to the quality of his affairs." In other words, not only is man as an individual a complicated being, but men and women collectively are even more complicated, exponentially so, and things need careful consideration by people working together in parliaments, elsewhere, in order to make the best of a difficult job. And since those people are all going to be arguing with one another, having different viewpoints, compromise is a necessary part of the political process. The alternative to this is the totalitarian form of government favored by revolutionaries, which won't tolerate any opposition and feels that therefore it can really get things done and changed. But while urging caution, Burke understands that change and reform are necessary, either to improve things or to deal with new circumstances. He's not some die-hard reactionary. He's content with the constitutional monarchy we still have in England. He's not trying to get back to the absolute monarchy they had in France until the revolution. In fact, while deploring the grotesque way in which the king and Marie Antoinette were arrested, he says, "If it could have been made clear to me that the king and queen of France were cruel tyrants, that they had formed a deliberate scheme for massacring the National Assembly, I should think their captivity just. But if I were to punish a wicked king, I should regard the dignity in avenging the crime. Justice is grave and decorous. Thirdly, and here we come to the crux of the matter, and you'll probably begin to see where this is all going. Burke stresses the importance of the past. He sees the state of things we inherit as precisely that, an inheritance, and says the idea of inheritance furnishes a sure principle of conservation and a sure principle of transmission, without at all excluding a principle of improvement. He was appalled by the way the French revolutionaries were destroying their inheritance in France, were destroying institutions and traditions, trying to engineer a new society from scratch. They were busy changing street names, changing the calendar, abolishing the monarchy, destroying the aristocracy, destroying the church. Most of the philosophers behind the revolution were anti-Christian to one degree or another. They designated September the 22nd, 1792, the day after the abolition of the monarchy, as the first day not only of the Republic, but also of year one in their new calendar. The Khmer Rouge, did the same in Cambodia in 1975, instituting year zero in an effort to break completely with the past. There's always this tendency, especially when we're young, probably naturally, to think that we know better. We're smarter than all the generations that have gone before us. We are the specially anointed ones, as Thomas Sowell, again, puts it. And if only we were in charge, how much better the world would be. In fact, as Sahaja Yogis, we are, in a way, the anointed ones, really, which makes us especially open to this danger of thinking we know everything already about how to run society before we've even begun to fully understand ourselves. It's a way of thinking, I would say, it's my view, epitomized by Greta Thunberg, for whom the previous generations have only succeeded in messing everything up and stealing her dreams. And for these anointed ones like her, says Thomas Sowell, traditions are likely to be seen as the dead hand of the past, relics of a less enlightened age, and not as the distilled experience of millions who faced similar human vicissitudes before. So Burke is stressing the importance of the past and of tradition. This is largely why he's called a conservative. He wants to conserve what's good and useful in our traditions. There's a saying ascribed to the composer Mahler. No one's quite sure where it originated, in the unconscious, I imagine, that tradition is not the worship of the ashes, but the preservation of the fire. And Burke, I think, would have agreed with that. He sees the way of society is gradually built up over centuries as being something like the accumulation of common law. It's built up slowly with precedents being established, then revised when new circumstances demand it, and so on. By trial and error methods, we have arrived at our present system of government. So why cast it aside just because it isn't perfect? What would be perfect? A society is not a mathematical equation. There can be no perfect solutions where different people with different temperaments and desires, needs and abilities are concerned. There can only be compromises and trade-offs and arrangements that will very likely need to be adjusted in time to come. And we will be much happier for accepting this than striving for non-existent utopian solutions in the form of abstract systems. In the following passage, you get a sense of Burke's ideas and of his language, the way he expresses them, because he was a great orator. He's talking about how a sense of value, the value of tradition, was still alive in England, and about, according to him, and about what he sees as our natural rights, as opposed to an abstract intellectual idea of human rights, the rights of man, which is being imposed in France. He's talking about what he sees as a living society, which, as he says elsewhere, is a partnership not only between those who are living, but between those who are living, those who are dead, and those who are to be born. So he's stressing the importance of continuity. The passage goes, and you can see, I think, the relevance of some of this to today. Thanks to our sullen resistance to innovation, thanks to the cold sluggishness of our national character, we still bear the stamp of our forefathers. We have not lost the generosity and dignity of thinking of the 14th century, nor as yet have we subtilized ourselves into savages by intellectual contortions. We are not the converts of Rousseau. We are not the disciples of Voltaire. Atheists are not our preachers. Madmen are not our lawgivers. We know that we have made no discoveries, and we think that no discoveries are to be made in morality, nor many in the great principles of government, nor in the ideas of liberty, which were understood long before we were born, altogether as well as they will be after the grave has heaped its mould upon our presumption, and the silent tomb shall have imposed its law on our pert loquacity. In England, we have not yet been completely disemboweled of our natural entrails. We have not been drawn and trussed in order that we may be filled, like stuffed birds in a museum, with chaff and rags and paltry blurred shreds of paper about the rights of man. We preserve the whole of our feelings still native and entire, unsophisticated by pedantry and infidelity. We have real hearts of flesh and blood beating in our bosoms. So he's emphasizing the importance of feeling, as opposed to the stress on ideas, which the French intellectuals were bringing in. Ideas, insofar as they come from the right side, point towards the future. Feelings, insofar as they are generated on the left side, point towards the past. And here, there's an important feature, and that's that we can love the things of the past, or the things that we have inherited from the past, buildings, townscapes, literature, landscapes, institutions, traditions, because they really exist. But we cannot love the things of the future because they don't exist. We can only love ideas about the things of the future, which is a very different kind of love, if it is love. Passion, let's call it. Burke goes on to talk about the value of these natural feelings, which he sees as being humble before God, deferential towards authority, chivalrous towards women, respectful and affectionate towards institutions, and so on. This role of authority is important for Burke, not because it prevents freedom, but because it provides a structure for freedom, for a sensible kind of freedom, dharmic kind. So he supported the idea of the monarchy, for example, but I get the feeling that for him it was something of what Socrates described as a noble lie. That's an important concept, this, I think. That is, it's something that rationally we may feel, monarchy I'm talking about, may feel has no real basis, but which we accept because it binds our society together and it has or can have an ennobling effect. I mean, Sri Mataji always behaved in a supportive way towards the monarchy here in England, I would say. I mean, she could be critical, but basically there was this show of respect for the monarchy. So this idea of the noble lie, I think, is a valuable one. And I think Burke would have accepted that. So he thought that if we had our normal, natural feelings intact, then naturally we would love our parents, birthplace, institutions, God. But today, this idea of natural feelings has been almost completely obliterated by the intellectuals. And he saw this beginning to happen. He saw abstract ideas being given much more weight than actual feelings. He saw the French intellectuals casting suspicion on and then substituting their abstract ideas for natural feelings and for Christianity itself, just as Nietzsche did later, even more comprehensively. So by now, I think we can see that in our terms, what Burke is doing is highlighting the qualities of the left side. He's stressing the value of the past, tradition, of collective experience over time, of collective national experience. He felt that, different nations have different experiences. So it's not that one system of government suits all of them. No. He's stressing the value of feelings, of the wisdom of the ages, as it's called, as opposed to the speculations, as he calls them, of the futuristic, individualistic, rationalizing ego. But I wouldn't say he was left-sided in the sense of someone who's gone too far into the left. He's presenting an idea of a society that evolves over time. It was very different from the revolutionary vision of a utopian society which would be perfect once the opposition had been persuaded out of their prejudices or coerced out of them or killed off, which would be much simpler. So this is where it gets confusing in a way, because with this stress on conserving the past and the left side, Burke is on the political right more than he's on the political left. And this is one of the confusing things about our political terminology. He's concerned with the value of the left side within us, yet he's on the political right to some extent. Whereas leftists, with their abstract ideas about human rights and multiculturalism and equality, diversity and inclusivity, and very often their lack of interest in the institution of marriage and the tendency towards atheism, it's very common on the left, are operating far more on the right side of our being. It's true that their LGBTQ policies break down the Mariadas on the left side, but the idea for this is all coming from the right, from the intellect. We also describe leftists and the revolutionaries as radicals, but to me it makes more sense to describe Burke as a radical in the real sense of the term, which is to do with the root, because his attitude is rooted in actual practice, actual history, whereas the leftists' attitude is only rooted in ideas which have no roots. So these ideas, abstract ideas even, can be useful, but for Burke, we have the other side being. So to finish with, I'm just going to ask what Blake thought of all this, because he was living at the time and he knew many of the major figures favorable to the revolution, including Tom Paine, Mary Wollstonecraft and William Godwin, another big writer on the subject. It's a very interesting period, the French Revolution, because so many of the features of our modern world really can be said to kick off there. It's always hard to be absolutely confident about what Blake meant in his writings because his style is so cryptic, but we know that he wrote the first part of a poem on the French Revolution, which was going to be in 7 parts and which was going to be published in 1791, the year after Burke's book. But in the event, the publisher didn't go ahead, and there's no sign that Blake actually wrote any of the further 6 parts. It was getting quite dangerous. The government here was realizing that the revolution was taking a very dark turn, and they didn't want it to come over here. The poem, Blake's poem as it stands, is certainly critical of the antiquated absolute French monarchy, but it's not a simple good against bad diatribe. On the one hand, Blake, like Burke, detested deism, which is, we need to look at this in much more detail, but it's the attempt to rationalize religion, getting rid of all the miraculous, transcendent stuff and emphasizing the moral stuff. And when Blake says, mock on, Voltaire, Rousseau, this recalls the quote of Burke, which I gave you above. Nor did Blake care for abstractions any more than Burke did. On the other hand, Blake wrote a short, unfinished poem about the beautiful Queen of France, which suggests to me, there's this phrase in it that suggests to me he had read Burke's Reflections, and it's not exactly complimentary towards Marie Antoinette. But it seems clear that over time, like Wordsworth and others, he became disillusioned with the French Revolution and with political matters in general. So after about 1793, we find him really talking less and less about politics. He became quite depressed at one point, and he begins to really focus on the spiritual side of things more wholly, and the desire to change man. And probably his views can be summed up in these lines from a short poem called The Grey Monk, written about 10 years later. The hand of vengeance found the bed to which the purple tyrant fled. The iron hand crushed the tyrant's head and became a tyrant in his stead. So that's the history of revolution in 4 lines. Okay, so that was, and as I say, an attempt to get to the principles of this right side and left side in politics, more on the right side this week. And now we're going to play a short extract from a beautiful talk of Sri Mataji's in Chelsham Road. So it's just the end of the talk.
Whose disciples are all our toddlers or still sucking their thumbs. So you should be a guru of a caliber that makes others grow too. I have hopes that my disciples will grow more than I am. I have hopes. That's my desire. That's what I want, that my disciples should grow. I mean, that will be my pride. Like Ganesha grew more than his own mother, who created. That's what is my desire. And that's what I want you to realize, that you are the hope of the world. Either you should not have taken birth in England. If you have taken, you have more responsibility not to be English and to be universal, because you have taken birth in the heart of the universe. You cannot be small-minded. You cannot be chicken-hearted. Either you are frightened or you are aggressive. This is an impossible situation. They have to be so strong that nothing should make you frightened. And such a person is the most benevolent personality. He's not frightened of anyone. Why should he harm anyone? Today, I hope you people really don't listen to my lecture, but put it in your heart. And understand that you have to become very dignified, majestic gurus of this universe. I would like to ask William Blake, what is he doing? When is he going to take his birth on this earth? When people of his caliber are going to be born in this country? Or they are all running away again to some other place to be born? Marriage system of England is wretched. You cannot adopt those methods that these people are having. You want to have the great people to be born to you, and every time you are running towards the divorce cases. How can they be born in this country? You have to give up all these wretched systems of this country. Good of this country should be taken, whatever is good in it, and transform this country into a beautiful thing. I mean, if you really love this country, then create it into a lovable place, isn't it? You must try to destroy all that is retarding the progress, the spiritual progress of this country. If you are a real Englishman, real is the word. You should not be proud of all the weaknesses that are rolled up in all these hills and dales. All unholy thoughts, all inauspicious behaviors, all must be discarded.
So we close our eyes and just go into meditation. Our self-confidence, our sense of our own identity, our benevolence towards others, these rest upon our innocence, on Sri Ganesha. Lord Bhairava, we worship you, we take refuge in you as the one who clarifies the Ida Nadi, who holds at bay the forces of chaos and destruction and adana and stupidity, and who conquers evil, who purifies our feelings, who purifies our understanding of the qualities of feeling. If the left side comes before the right side, then the root is more on this left side. If we can establish this, then we're in a much better position to think clearly and act justly with discrimination. So the one other thing to say, which Blake always stressed, which goes beyond, takes us beyond the conflict between left and right in politics, is to forgive. So if we just, as usual, say, Mother, I forgive everyone, and Mother, I forgive myself. So if Pretty, you'd like to go on with the music, Ragyaman Kalyan, and if anybody wants silence, of course, they can just turn the volume off. And then coming up to 8 o'clock, we'll come to a finish. So we come to the end of tonight's meditation, and in a couple of weeks I'll be doing another talk, I think, and this will continue with this theme of trying to understand the principles underlying our culture today, although going back in history. And I feel it's an important thing we do that we situate our practice of Sahaja Yoga in this field of cultural principles that are all around us and determining much of the behavior in the society, and that explain why we find it so difficult to establish Sahaja Yoga in this world. Okay, so thank you all for listening. Jai Shri Ram.